Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of Roughly Chinese. I'm your host Mimi, and today I'm joined by two very special guests, Dee Knight as well as Anlin Wang. So we're going to get into some topics today, but first of all, I want to say I'm very happy to have you both here in China with us. It's always an honor, and I feel like our conversations are always the most fruitful when you're actually here and you've been experiencing China for yourselves. So I just wanted to start to introduce you to our lovely audience. If you wouldn't mind giving brief introductions about yourself, Dee, if you'd like to start.
Sure, thank you. Thank you very much for being here. I'm excited and delighted to be here. That might show. I'm a member of the Advisory Council of the Friends of Socialist China, and I also serve on the China Working Group of the International Committee of the Democratic Socialists of America. I'm the author of Befriending China, People-to-People Peacemaking, as well as a couple of other books, which I'm happy to say are due to be translated and published here in China early next year. But I guess for the viewers of this audience, the fact that they're available pretty much everywhere in English is the main thing. The other title is A Realistic Path to Peace, From Genocide to Global War and How We Can Stop It. I've been active in the U.S. anti-war and anti-imperialist movement for pretty much my adult life, which is pretty long. I was a war resistor during the U.S. war against Vietnam, living in Canada from 1968 to 74, and was a founding board member of the National Council for Universal Unconditional Amnesty from 1973 to 76. Since then, I have worked as a publishing consultant for the UN Development Program and also for Nicaragua's Sandinista newspaper Barricada during the 1980s. You can find my work or more about me at deeknight.blog.
Awesome. That is a very extensive catalog that you have. Very, very impressive. And we'll talk more about this splendid book later. Anlin, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Sure. Thank you again for all your work and for having us here today. My own resume is not nearly as impressive as Dee's, but I'm a Chinese American organizer from the US. I primarily organize with the Democratic Socialists of America. There I've served on leadership for the Philadelphia chapter, and I currently serve on the steering committee for the International Committee, where I also lead the China Working Group as well.
Wow. Okay. So there's some connections here, which we'll get into. But I just kind of wanted to know, you've both been spending the last few weeks in China, right? And you've been here before, you've also been here before, and you've been learning firsthand how China works, really understanding in depth what China's about. And you obviously, and you already knew this, know that China is actually not the threat that US says that it is. So I wanted to ask you both to just share a little bit about your time in China so far. This trip, previous trips, however you want. If you'd like to start, Dee.
Well, I think China's biggest threat to the United States is the threat of a good example. It is an example of what a fair and just and harmonious society can look like. One of the most impressive parts about that for me, forgive me for saying so, is the role of Chinese women. During our visit last week, which was my second visit to the province of Guizhou in southwest China, we were hosted by leaders of the Provincial Foreign Affairs Office, two incredibly dynamic, revolutionary communist women who treated us like friends and comrades. They also, in addition to encouraging us to participate in the 80th anniversary celebrations there, which were celebrating the International Medical Relief Corps, a multinational support effort in the medical field during China's resistance to Japanese aggression. We felt like VIPs for being solidarity activists, which is always great. We also were able to get close-up views of the targeted poverty alleviation program, which really focused on Guizhou, an intensely mountainous province. 90% of the land area is covered by rugged mountains, which has caused the people to be very isolated there. It's very interesting to see. I mean, one of the things about it for me was to understand the role of the party and of the country's leadership in mobilizing the whole country to overcome extreme poverty in extremely isolated areas. There, one of the things that stood out for me was the amazing confidence that all the people that we met showed, from older people to middle-aged professionals to young people, poor and middle class. I say middle class because I certainly have not met anybody from the rich class. I know there are some, but in our experience, we were meeting ordinary people who are making China what it is today, a country where there is great equality, great sense of inclusion and equality, and a kind of optimism and confidence that ordinary people seem to express without saying a word. But whenever they do talk, one gets a sense of a society in control of itself, and people who are confident and open-minded and open-hearted.
That's a very moving description of, I think, a province that I've also been to before, but every time I think I hear our international guests coming and experiencing that, I think that's an extremely valuable experience to have, because like you said yourself, you really get to see the lives of everyday people and the pride and the generosity and the optimism, the revolutionary optimism that doesn't just exist in the very robustly developed megacities, but also in the regions that are considered poorer, but are still developed and are still robust and bustling and very cultural at the same time. So really appreciate that insight. And Anlin, I'd love to hear about your experiences too.
Sure. As a Chinese American, I've come to China a few times as a kid too. And, but that was from a period of 2012 to 2023, I didn't come back at all. And when I did come back in 2023, over 10 years in between, I could barely recognize the same cities that I'd come to many times as a child. And that to me really stuck out as, here me and Dee are working our butts off in the United States, fighting for progress for the people. And yet we come here and see the same progress that we've been fighting for encapsulated in real life. And there's just no sort of replacing the experience of seeing that firsthand. And Guizhou encapsulates that to the nth degree, I would say.
Wow. I mean, I think you just hit a very important nail, which kind of leads to my next question. But I think it's very interesting how, because I also lived in the West for a while, I lived in New York specifically, I saw at least in the leftist circles how there's constant debate about what China is, right? About, is China imperialist? Is China even socialist? Like all these kinds of ideological debates, wondering, speculating, even accusing China of certain things. But like you said, I think, at least for me, my frustration is people who have not seen China and who are experiencing that fight, that struggle in America, which is an extremely important fight to fight within the belly of the beast. I think there's almost a level of hypocrisy when critiquing China, because it's like everything that you have experienced in China so far, like you said, you can actually see material improvements and conditions. You coming since you're a child, I also was coming since I was a child. I can say that when I returned to China, through the decades, the sky gets bluer, the grass gets greener. Like literally,
That's true.
the streets get cleaner, the people get happier. Like it's just all these very obvious material shifts that actually in the West are deteriorating. And so I think, at least for me, those in the West who make these accusations, one, I think maybe it's a projection of what is happening in the US and maybe a level of frustration. But I want to ask you because you have been fighting that fight and because you're doing such important work for China and we appreciate it so much, what are some of the conversations that you do have, and how are people viewing China now, or what has been, if anything, if at all, a shift or misunderstandings in those conversations?
May I? Well, I think that one of the things is that, for me, I became aware of China and its revolution during the 1960s. And at that time, of course, it was a revolution from poverty in poverty. And as we leftists who became fascinated with the revolution observed it, we saw the heroism of poor people fighting for equality and making a society where people share. It became kind of a romantic notion. Socialism is poor people holding each other up. Now we have here in China a socialism based on common prosperity, where here in the streets of Shanghai and also in Beijing, we see modern cities that rival the most sparkling skyscraper-dominated cities of the United States, whether it's New York or Boston, Chicago or Los Angeles or San Francisco. Sparkling cities that are much, much cleaner, of course, and in fact more modern than those cities that I mentioned. And you walk down the street and you see Vuitton and along with McDonald's and Starbucks. And some of us romantic leftist from the 60s look at it and say, oh, my revolutionary China is no more. What we have is some kind of new capitalist China. Well, in fact, putting Shanghai and Beijing together with Guizhou can help to see what we really have. There is a leadership here that is determinedly trying to equalize a society by raising the level as well as reducing inequality. That is a kind of socialism that I think can be a hope for the future. It's also necessary to mention that in the so-called left in the United States, there are people that are really, what you might say, afraid of their shadow. The idea that actually a good socialism can emerge and be really strong and give hope for the future is something that clashes with good old-fashioned white supremacy and imperialist notions that the countries of the West are the ones that know what to do. And the idea that there could be socialism in the poor countries, even as they rise up, doesn't seem to compute. It's an idealism. I think of that kind of socialist ideology basically as Platonic socialist idealism that fails to deal with the fact that struggling for a new society is about improving our conditions, working together to do that. And this is something that I guess my final point is, those who want to see what socialism can look like and how it emerges should come to China.
Wow. I mean, I think that is such a clear and sharp description of what actual socialism in practice will look like instead of socialism as an idea, which I think is maybe the place that Western Marxism or Western socialism can get stuck in, right?
Very much so.
It's a bit of a quicksand kind of situation where people sink into it and then they just get really twisted in these debates of, well, is it socialist? It's not. Why isn't it? You know, a lot of that without actually seeing what socialism can do and has done in reality. Anling, I'd like to hear about you as well. So like you said, you work with DSA and you're in the committee. Could you remind me again what it's called?
Yeah, the DSA International Committee is the body for the Democratic Socialists of America that handles working on foreign relations and anti-imperialist organizing from the national level.
And your focus is China?
Yes, I help organize the China Working Group.
I'd love to hear about that. You know, and as you're also in it, I mean, you're both organizing in the China Working Group. How are those conversations? Kind of similar to what Dee Knight was describing.
Sure.
Yeah.
I think the phenomenon that Dee describes is certainly a reality. I think it's a reality that goes beyond even the left. And so within the DSA, though, Democratic Socialist America does have 2 points in our national platform ratified by the highest decision-making body of the organization at the National Convention, where each chapter elects its delegates to represent them. And so in 2021, the National Convention did ratify a national platform that did include 2 points about China. So these are points that unite, I think, all DSA members. 1, opposing the U.S. wargaming and escalation and tension rattling and saber rattling with China. And 2, seeking global cooperation seeking cooperation on issues of global importance, such as pandemics and most especially climate change. Beyond that, I think it is true, the phenomenon that Dee describes is something that I do encounter and experience. At the same time, I am also happy to say that there is a high degree of unity on the desire to seek cooperation on these biggest issues, though. Great. That said, though, the phenomenon that Dee describes of the idealism of Western Marxism or Western socialists is a real one. But at the same time, my own experience is that good faith people, not even beyond just the Western left, Westerners in general, who have a curiosity about China will pursue that, and you can have a very productive conversation with them without getting into a bunch of sniping.
Yes. Yeah, I do think that, at least also for myself, right now is a pivotal moment where people are questioning the validity and the truth of Western media, right? I mean, with Palestine, it's clear what the Western media says is BS. But it's so funny that a lot of people I speak to, despite them saying, oh, everything they say about Palestine is true, they still say everything everything they're saying about Palestine is false. Everything that Western media says about China is still true, unquestionably, right? But I do think there is a shift now. There is a question now. I mean, my own personal messages used to always get bombarded with, well, what about this? What about this? What about this talking point? What about this CIA talking point, right? Now it's calmed down a lot. I think people are actually, instead of asking me for the answers to challenge me, are doing their own research because maybe there's more resources available thanks to folks like you.
It's also thanks to folks like you and also your friend, President Xi Jinping, who happens to be a significantly higher quality leader than any leaders that have emerged recently in the West. It's also something that is happening, what you might call as the evolution of consciousness. Recently, there was a poll that showed just over half of Americans now don't think of China as horrible the way they used to. That is a change in percentage of about half of those who did always, it used to be about 2/3 of people in the United States thought all kinds of bad things about China. Now over half think a lot of good things about China. That's an evolution that's based on some things like, for example, Comrade Donald issuing ridiculous tariff threats against China, and his war secretary trying to round up the friendly countries that surround China and recruit them into a war against China. Something that's ridiculous, especially when many people at least, are aware that in the constant wargaming exercises that go on in Washington, every single time Washington loses. You know, what does that mean? It means that they ought to get those young American soldiers and sailors out of the East Asia where they're sitting ducks.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Comrade Donald does seem to be doing a lot of self-destruction, and in that way, indirectly helps China, right? It's been very interesting, especially as Chinese netizens kind of react to his actions. You know, I think there is like a political clarity over here because of the education, because of the news. And so people are very aware of Donald Trump's every move, and they're just like, does he hate America? You know, they're kind of asking that.
That's a very good question.
Yeah, it is very interesting. But I mean, as I was saying before, you have both done so much in terms of changing that ideological shift and being part of that evolution of ideas. And Dee, you wrote this book called Befriending China. Let's hold it up for the audience and show people.
Befriending China, people-to-people peacemaking.
Yeah, and I love the people-to-people peacemaking, that subtitle, because I think it says a lot about exactly what needs to be done for a common prosperous future. So I wanted to ask you, how have your people-to-people interactions been here while you've been in China? I mean, you mentioned a bit about especially the women leaders in Guizhou, but I'd like to hear about more. You know, who have you been able to speak to, and what kind of maybe even everyday experiences have really enlightened you even more than you already are?
Well, I think I'd like to start with the hardest one first. Back in November of 2023, we had a small delegation called China is Not Our Enemy. And we requested to go to Xinjiang on purpose. I wanted to have an eyewitness understanding of what really is happening, since that brave diplomat who was Trump's Secretary of State back then, Pompeo, said that there was genocide and slavery in Xinjiang. And I didn't believe it, but I knew that lie could never be overcome unless we go and see for ourselves. So that's what I did. And I met with a whole range of people. I would like to spotlight another young woman in Xinjiang who worked in the fabulous bazaar that is a meeting place not only for people from within China, but also traders and merchants traveling across the border from the stands to acquire Chinese merchandise and bring it back. This was a young Uyghur woman, probably mid-20s, maybe a little younger, who spoke nearly perfect English. I asked her, how did you learn to speak English so well? She said, well, I learned it at one of the job training centers that we have here. Those training centers have been called concentration camps and prisons and detention centers by American policymakers and their parroting media. It was a dramatic illustration for me of how interpretation matters. You know, the CIA courteously offered satellite photographs to American media to show that these training centers were in fact detention centers and concentration camps. It turns out that some of the people who use these training centers are bussed in from the countryside. Xinjiang is an enormous province, and the majority of the people, certainly the majority of the Uyghurs, live outside the cities in the countryside, and it's one of the problems there. And until about 8 or 10 years ago, unemployment was very high there, and it did provide good motivation for the separatists who were really bussed in by U.S. operatives to foment separatism. Mm-hmm. The response of the central government here in Beijing was to provide intensive training. That in many cases meant overnight stays for weekdays with the opportunity to return home on the weekends. That's not exactly detention. Mm-hmm. That's free education for people who need it in order to prepare them for insertion into the workforce. And it has happened on a large scale. That was the first thing. The other thing, our guide took us to Kashgar in the southwestern part of Xinjiang province, which is the center of cotton growing, which is a major crop in Xinjiang. I believe Xinjiang is in fact the primary source of cotton, mm-hmm. as well as the primary source of oil. The important thing for me there was to witness the cotton harvest, which was in full swing in early November when we went. The question was, how was the cotton harvested? We witnessed the use of large mechanized combine harvesters, just like the ones made in USA, I might say, mm-hmm. just like the ones that were used in the harvest in the eastern Oregon wheat fields where I grew up. And that was important to me. It's true that there were a small handful of trim workers who were contract laborers who had to go around the edges of the fields to get the cotton that the big combines couldn't reach. And we also witnessed the transport vehicles used to bring this cotton to both to the processing center and the transport centers. These combines cut the cotton and put it into big 3-ton bales, so that in fact what you have is 10 bales on a truck. You're looking at basically 30 tons of cotton on a truck being transported to a processing center. The whole thing is mechanized. That was the kind of witnessing, along with visiting one of the largest mosques in China, in Kashgar, which we were allowed to enter. We could see, first of all, that it holds somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 faithful. When we went in, there were several hundred, but on many days, it's filled to capacity with people doing their daily prayers. I noticed that there was a plaque outside indicating that in the early 2000s, the State Council dedicated a maintenance program involving really very large-scale money to make sure that the mosque was able to serve its congregation and the surrounding city. And it added that that's part of China's commitment to freedom of religion, not unlike seeing the very large Buddhist temples that exist in Beijing, as well as in northern Shanxi province. These were the kinds of things that stood out. You know, when in northern Shanxi, we visited several mosque temples, as we did also in Beijing, and I noticed an amazing level of devotion and reverence practiced by the visitors, and learned later that about 15% of the Chinese population are practicing Buddhists, which, I'm not particularly religious, even though I was raised Catholic, but the fact that religious freedom is an ordinary, widely accepted factor in Chinese society is just another proof. Forgive me, I've spoken too long.
I mean, I really appreciate everything you've said, because not only are you describing Xinjiang and addressing some of the myths that we have to tackle every day, but you have actually seen it for yourself. And I think these first-hand accounts are the most powerful when it comes to telling people what you actually saw. I mean, there's nothing that you're not getting paid to say this, you went for yourself. You paid money to go see it for yourself.
I did, yes.
Because you had questions, right?
Yes.
It's not like you were just trying to fulfill this agenda. You had questions and you got them answered just by going and seeing for yourself.
Yes, and it made such a powerful impression on me that I really did feel obligated to write about it. And that's what Befriending China is about. It's not a scholarly tome. It's really meant to provide a close-up picture to ordinary people, especially young people in the United States, who are filled with mystified notions. And if they can read eyewitness accounts, get descriptions of how life really is, it will help. There's a description, for example, of the official response to the COVID pandemic that broke out back in 1920. And one of the things that I spotlight in the book was one of the young doctors who was actually from the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, a beautiful woman in her 30s in a military uniform getting her COVID shot. She's got her fist in the air and a big smile on her face, expressing a kind of a fearless determination to go in there and treat the unnumbered patients who were being rushed into these hospitals that were built over a period of 2 weeks in Wuhan. And I was thinking, let's compare that to how Comrade Donald responded to the COVID epidemic in the United States. I live in New York City. We saw death trucks lined up outside the hospitals in our city.
Yeah, I remember that. Yeah. I appreciate you so much for talking about that. It's not an easy topic to talk about, and it is a very sharp comparison to how China dealt with a crisis of humanity versus how America did, right?
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Dee, for sharing that.
Excuse me, yeah.
It's okay. Do you need a tissue?
No, I'm good.
Okay. Anlin, I want to move over to you because you also have a very specific interest, right? You are interested in climate change. And I think that's been a very hot topic lately because people have accused China of many things when it comes to climate change, especially pollution, etc. I think China is right now in a stage of actually rejuvenating climate and creating renewable clean energy initiatives, carbon neutrality. And meanwhile, the US is sending bombs and tanks and causing so much pollution, destroying the climate because of its alliance with Israel. So I wanted to ask you about your experience with climate change here and how, or any initiatives that you've experienced or witnessed for yourself while being in China.
Sure. Where to even begin? What's clear is that China is building towards an ecological civilization as they claim. And I would say the sort of single biggest obvious difference is that there is a clear good faith commitment to that principle of an ecological civilization. It's not just words, it's not just hot air. And that contrasts with the experience in the West, where by the posturing around green energy, the transition to a carbon-free, a carbon-neutral society is oftentimes used, has often been used as a geopolitical posturing mechanism, as opposed to something that, as opposed to a real good faith transition. So contrast, for example, China's approach with the EU, with EU nations and the United States, where the West clearly uses this as rhetoric that is secondary to the first policy principle of maintaining Western hegemony and capitalism above all else. If a green transition threatens those things, well, then it's okay to put the green transition second. And that example can be seen just about everywhere. here in China, when we traveled through Guizhou, we saw miles and miles, kilometers and kilometers of wind farms, solar farms. When we travel from on the train from Beijing to Shanghai, we see the same thing. Rooftop solar on little rural villages. Wind farms as far as the eye can see, and wind farms that even have colored tips, which I don't know if that's the purpose for them, but a simple colored tip on a windmill reduces bird deaths by 80%.
Wow.
And all these sorts of things, all these sorts of little principles, all these little things, that's just what's visible. The less visible stuff are, for example, things like AI data centers, right? The world generally is under the consensus that AI development is going to be crucial to 21st century economic development. But contrast again China's approach with the Western approach. The Western approach understood that the development of large language models was going to require building up data centers and building up all these expensive and, more importantly, carbon-intensive data centers and training sites. But the development of those things, they're happy to use the fossil fuels and pollute the environment and even hurt the neighborhoods by polluting the air that they're building these data centers in, directly hurting the people, not just the people, but the planet as well. In contrast, the development of China's new AI data centers these are required to use 80% renewable energy in order to create them at all. And that sort of thing makes it clear to me why, over the years, the skies literally get bluer. It's not just a matter of just better cameras and better photo editing.
Yes, yeah.
What we're seeing is, in real time, less pollution over time, a greener economy over time, a greener society over time. And that is visible as far as the eye can see. There is not a single place that I've been to where it's not just immediately in your face.
Right, absolutely. I think that's a really important point about the AI data centers too. I think it's been a really big conversation in China about the contrast between Western AI data centers and Chinese data centers, right? Because there's such sophisticated scientific research here that actually ensures that these data centers don't cause more pollution or don't ruin, local communities, which I think they do very carelessly in the United States. But then I think, again, because of the hegemonic nature of the US, these things get all collided, right? And people, again, have misunderstandings because they see how it is in the West and they assume that it's like that everywhere else, which is why, going back to your book, Befriending China, like you say for yourself, China is a source of hope. And I think that's a really beautiful way to describe China because it offers all these different alternatives and solutions to the problems that the US has been not only facing, but perpetuating for decades, right?
Yeah, there's a little more I want to mention about
Please,
that.
yeah. No, please.
Well, thinking again about the Southwest, about Guizhou, one of the things that stood out dramatically for us was the bridges and the new highways. Those bridges are amazing. And the thing that is important to know is that the mountainous provinces' isolation was largely caused by the fact that people simply couldn't get around. Now, as we travel, we're going through tunnel after tunnel, drilled right straight through these mountains. We're being transported on among the highest bridges in the world. I gather that 50 of the world's highest bridges are now in Guizhou, and they were all built in the last decade and a half. And they really are so high that we were invited to go up in them. I was one of a small number of us who couldn't do it because I'm acrophobic. But I mean, literally, these bridges are high. And very long because they're spanning from mountain to mountain. What it has done is made that formerly isolated mountain province fully integrated into the national economy, and it's combined, of course, with the social modernization, which involves making it possible, for example, for children and young people to go to school half-hour walk from their house instead of a many-hour walk, having to walk with a week's worth of lunches on their backs in order to get to school and have to stay there for the whole week because it's too much to go back and forth. Little things like that, also making it possible for access to modern medical care, with the ability for medical personnel to get to remote villages quickly, for ambulances to take people out quickly to state-of-the-art hospitals. All of this is part of what you might call the development of socialist infrastructure. And the nice thing is that, as you say, China is generating hope by delivering this same thing to its neighboring countries and to countries in Africa. And that matters a lot.
A lot. I think that, I didn't even think to bring that up, but that is a very, very incredibly poignant part of the equation too, is that the common prosperity does not just limit itself to within China,
right,
but actually goes out to the global South countries.
Yep.
And that is very, very powerful. And again, Western media tries to paint it as Chinese interference or whatever, but you can see what China is building in these places. They're building libraries in Latin American countries. They're building train stations. They're building ports. They're building so many infrastructural things that even the US lacks now.
They're building schools in Iraq,
right,
that were destroyed by the US during the war.
Exactly. I mean, the US and its own infrastructure, there's always these videos of photos comparing the US New York subway, as someone who lives in New York, and the Chinese metro system. And I've gone to rural areas in China, and their metro systems are extremely robust too. It's not, again, just limited to the big cities, where even in the US, the ones in the big cities are crumbling, right?
Yeah. Well, take, for example, returning again to Xinjiang, this time to the capital of Urumqi, also known here as Urumqi. The subway there is of the same design and style and quality as the subways in Shanghai and Beijing. We're talking about state-of-the-art subways that are quiet, that are ultra safe. So, for example, when the subway stops, there's a plastic gate that opens to make sure that people can only enter at the door of the train, and that they have very little danger of the kind of accidents that we see all too often in our subways. And they're quiet. And inside the train, there's an announcement at every stop, very quiet, but very audible. One other thing, when you get out of the train, there are escalators at every subway stop, and both inside and outside the stations, there are public bathrooms, something that all of us New Yorkers really need, and public bathrooms exist on the main streets of Shanghai, Beijing, I believe all the major cities, including Urumqi.
Wow, it's really, really wonderful to hear about your travels. And I think that's why your book, this is an honest review, but the second I picked it up, I actually didn't want to put it down, because I felt like it was a friend telling me about China. I like you said, it actually is accessible in so many ways and paints a very illustrious picture, instead of, be full of the jargon that some of us can experience when it comes to the academic text. But yours is like a first-hand account of the beacon of light that you've been able to experience in China. And I think that is just so amazing, and I'm so glad it's going to be translated into Chinese.
Well, you're convincing me, and I hope you convince the readers. Needless to say, we want people to read it. Thank you.
Absolutely. So what I've been hearing from the both of you in terms of your trips to China and what you've been able to see firsthand is that obviously, like you said, people-to-people peacemaking, cultural exchange is really important to actually see the material conditions. to see the material conditions of what is happening in China and its progress. And the US still continues to paint China as a threat, right? And maybe it is a threat to the US hegemony, which none of us want, but the way they're painting it is very, misguided and very untrue, right? Which is what all of us are trying to battle every single day in all of our prospective work.
Well, I would just like to say that I think for both Anlin and me, people-to-people peacemaking is not just a commitment, but a real campaign. Our presence here is kind of what you might call exploratory or exemplary. We're trying to pave the way so that significantly larger numbers of people, especially young people, but people of all ages in the US can come here. We also look forward to collaborating with the China Academy and Wave Media to find ways to open the doors to really interesting ways for Americans to learn about the reality of China. One last point on that, I mentioned in the book about China's official invitation to 50,000 young American students to come to China to study, to apply for scholarships, which are available online, scholarships that include full tuition, as well as room and board and help with learning the language. I wish I were 24. Just to give a number, I would take it in a minute because it's taken me too many years already to be able to develop survival Chinese, and I'm still not there. But, if a young person who wants to build a future finds out what's possible in China, maybe those thousands of students will come, and they'll be very glad they did.
Yeah, I mean, that actually segues really well into the kind of update that I got today. So, of course, I was browsing the news and reading what's happening. And I saw an article, or many articles, headlines that talked about how Trump is now planning to impose a $250 fee on many global south countries, such as Mexico, Argentina, Brazil, India, and China, of course. And I wanted to ask you, Anlin, as someone who's been coming to China and also obviously has grown up in the States, how can you compare and contrast what's going on? Because China is actually inviting, like you said, more and more people to come, see our culture, see our history, learn our language. And yet the US is making those borders higher and higher up and making it more difficult and more expensive for people in global south countries to see America. Why do you think that is? Is it an exertion of power? Is he trying to hide something? Yeah, I kind of want to pick your brain about that.
The US, I think even before Trump, was just not as open and inviting to the world as China has been. But under the Trump administration, that's been amped up to a 10 or an 11. This new imposition is part of this Trump administration's efforts, almost explicit efforts, to turn this society into an explicitly white supremacist one. Previously, as leftists, it was pretty consistent, pretty straightforward to interpret U.S. policymaking from the lens of what makes the U.S. ruling class, the U.S. capitalist class, the most profits. But now they're clearly willing to sacrifice even that class's profits just to enforce an ideological framework, an ideological idealism of a previous return to an older society when white supremacy was explicit, the explicit policy, the explicit culture. And that's something that contrasts sharply with China's dramatic expansion of vis-a-vis policies across the globe. And that sort of contrast makes clear why it is that we here in the United States have a responsibility to continue pushing not just our society to be open, but also for us to learn from the Chinese example and bring Americans over to China.
I mean, I think it says a lot, doesn't it? Because like you called him, Comrade Trump, I think what he's doing, like you said, is trying to bring America back to a time. But then I think in that same sense, he is actually exposing what America has always been, which is it was started and founded in white colonial supremacy. They did they performed a genocide on the indigenous people of America. That is the origin story of the America that we know of today, and is what Trump is trying to return to. So I think, again, he's taking the veil off and showing people the monster that America, since its beginnings, has always been.
He's panicking too. That it's worth bearing in mind that this kind of racist reaction doesn't come out of strength. It comes out of weakness. You know, the reality is that Trump is articulating a totally reactionary right-wing version of the general anxiety that millions of people in the United States feel about the collapse of the dream. You know, reality is pinching hard ever since the deindustrialization that was engineered by American investors who figured out that they could make better profits by pulling their plants out of Detroit and the industrial belt in the Midwest and sending them either to Mexico, to Thailand, to China, to many other places for low wages and vast markets. In the China case, of course, the vast market was a very big deal, you know, and they thought, well, we can make a fortune if we can transplant these factories to China and then sell products to this enormous Chinese population that is gradually developing purchasing power. What did they do after that? As millions of people lost their jobs, despair set in, hopelessness increased along with homelessness. Trump made it out that the people to blame for this were immigrants. You know, suddenly my family and other Latino immigrants were accused of being murderers and rapists. I have murderers and rapists fixing the bricks on the building outside my house in my apartment building in New York City. These are people who were really driven out of Mexico as well as other Latin American countries by U.S. interventionist economic policies. And it's worth noting, by the way, that roughly a third of the geographical territory of the United States was part of Mexico until the middle of the 19th century. And that's a long story that I don't want to get into, but the real thing is that talking about making America great again, what he means is make America white again, make America a surging new capitalist force again, something that won't happen because the world has already passed that by. And the only way he can think to do this is by attacking the victims at the bottom of the society on the one hand, and trying to intensify U.S. military aggression and economic strangulation outside the country. But it's a policy and a practice that's doomed to fail. And our job is to help build the kind of resistance and transformative energy that can bring about a future that we can believe in.
Absolutely. I mean, with everything you're saying, I actually thought of a protest that happened in Australia recently. So Australia, like we all know, is just one of the obedient dogs of the US, even though it's so far away and actually located way closer to Asia and, you know. But anyway, there was actually recently these protests where white supremacists in Australia were protesting against a similar situation. They're protesting against immigrants, and Australia also, I mean, same history. It's a settler colony. And so these white Australians are also carrying on in the shadow of Donald Trump and just echoing it all and saying, oh, we want white Australia again. You know, we want all these immigrants out. They are the source of all our problems, which is just such an, again, twisted way of seeing what is a threat and what is the actual reason that these Western countries are on the decline. So I want to end with my final question. I'm sorry if it is not the most uplifting one, but actually I think we could turn it into an uplifting one. Obviously, these Western nations are struggling and they are kind of writhing in their seats and very, they're projecting and they're fearful. And like you said, it comes from a place of weakness. But still, because they're acting almost so violently towards their own people and in such a volatile manner, they are still carving China or immigrants or all these other forces as a threat, right? As the bad guy themselves. And I wanted to ask you guys, what is the danger of people actually believing that? What is the danger of the manufacturing of consent to go to war against China? Anlin, if you'd like to start.
Go ahead.
Of course, as a Chinese American and as someone who witnessed the hate crime waves against Chinese Americans, Asian Americans in the US, that sort of threat is on my mind. But I think to speak to a wider audience, the threat of US of escalating tensions, potentially going to war with China, goes beyond just Asian Americans. It goes beyond just Americans. It goes beyond even the entire Chinese people. It impacts the entire planet. There was a UK Actuarial Institute this year, which put out a report estimating just the economic damage, not the damage to lives that climate change is likely to cause by the end of this century. Mm-hmm. They estimated that if we do nothing, that even if we are able to get an optimistic outcome, one of the best case scenarios is global GDP will contract by 20%.
20%, wow.
More likely, at the pace we're going, we're looking at, and this is the UK Actuarial Institute, this is not a group of socialists and communists and environmentalists making these assessments. They estimate that the path they're going on will probably be closer to 50%. Right? What US-China war means is the two world's leading powers not engaging in climate cooperation, not addressing the biggest existential threat of our time, and instead killing each other for the sake of one side trying to establish hegemony over the entire planet. The hopeful side here is that if we get climate cooperation, we can see living standards improve for not just Chinese people, not just for Americans, but everybody, the entire working class, the entire regular people of the planet. Our lives can improve with climate cooperation, with technology sharing, with creating a future of humanity for all, instead of just trying to maintain just the wealth and social standing and socioeconomic standing of a handful of people at the top. But it takes cooperation and dropping the wargaming.
I would like to add a wrinkle on the silver lining concept. My own concern is that Comrade Trump is driving us right off a cliff. And the likelihood is that he, along with his billionaire buddies, are going to drive the entire world capitalist economy into collapse. If that happens, and it looks very likely, what it's going to do is bring up the next obvious solution, which is to take it over and run it on a socialist basis. I think that we're looking to a time when the victims of capitalism and imperialism are going to have to organize ourselves together to take over. And, it seems scary to a lot of people, but when you really think about it, it's the hope of the future. And I think we can do it.
I think so too. And just know that China is always here. as a beacon of hope.
Thank you for that.
Well, thank you both so much for being here with me today at Roughly Chinese. And I've had such a pleasure having this conversation with you. I hope you can come back soon. Thank you everyone for watching this episode. And please tune in to the next one. Like, comment, and subscribe and let us know what else you want us to talk about. Bye!